Tonight, we'll begin by recapping Joe Biden's latest dehumanizing comments about black voters yesterday on The Breakfast Club. Listen to this.
But I tell you, if you have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or Trump, then you ain't black.
The media wants you to believe that Joe Biden is just a jovial guy. Black liberals want you to believe that Joe Biden has always been a friend to African Americans, at least the clean and articulate ones. He even gets a pass for sexual assault allegations by one of his own former staffers. But the truth is, Joe Biden probably is just a jovial guy. When never having worked a real job a day in your life, becoming a multimillionaire while in public office, and his relatives. Joe Biden has never been a friend to African Americans, and you heard that from Kamala Harris. Her comments were not about busing policy. This was about Joe Biden spending his entire career cozying up to the most vile and publicly anti-black racists to advance his personal career. And this was during one of the most racially sensitive times in our country, a time of darkness for many black Americans. And it worked. Joe Biden was first elected to the United States Senate in 1972, before I was even born. He was leading the fight early in his career about busing students across school districts so that black children could benefit from an integrated education. However, in order to prevent their kids from being in the same schools with our kids, Joe Biden sought and obtained the support of Herman Talmadge and James Eastland, racist Southern Democrats who opposed desegregation. He agreed with these men and said so during a speech, quote, "In order to even the score, we must now give the black man a head start or even hold the white man back. I don't buy that." Delaware, 1975. But don't take my words for it. Here's Joe Biden himself.
Eastland, Stennis, Thurman, all these men became my friends. He said, "What would Jim Eastland do for you in Delaware?" And I was in a tough re-election. I said, "Mr. Chairman, some places you'd help and some places you'd hurt." And he looked at me, all kidding aside, in the Senate dining room with Herman Talmadge sitting there and said, "Well, I'll come to Delaware and campaign for you or against you, son, whichever will help you the most." I used to go over after every executive session of the United States Senate Judiciary Committee and go into Jim Eastland's office, which was catty corner, and sit down. He'd allow me to ask him all the dumb questions a young kid would want to ask. Who was the most powerful man you ever met, Senator? What was the most significant thing that ever occurred since you've been here?
The Democratic frontrunner, Joe Biden, said something at a fundraiser last night that is, I'm going to call it insensitive. It's much worse than that. I don't know what to call it except stupid. He said, "I was in the caucus with James O. Eastland. He never called me boy. He always called me son." Mr. Biden then brought up a deceased Georgia senator, a guy like Herman Talmadge, one of the meanest guys I ever knew. You go down the list of all these guys. Well, guess what? At least there was some civility. We got things done. Those were two racist members of the United States Senate. Why?
I'm told by a couple advisors to the former vice president that he's been urged and asked and cautioned and warned to not use these segregationist senators as examples. It adds to the already sort of high burden he's trying to make to modernize himself, if you will, and then using the word boy.
Joe Biden has to be really careful about his memories. If he wants to bring this stuff up, it can cost him a lot.
We'll see if he wants to clean it up as he's dealing with some blowback and some deserved blowback, among it the New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio, one of the candidates for president. It's 2019 and Joe Biden is longing for the good old days of civility typified by James Eastland. Eastland thought my multiracial family should be illegal and that whites were entitled to, I'll let you read the rest of the tweet because I'm not going to say it on television, but it's violent acts against African Americans.
Eastland, Stennis, Thurman, all these men became my friends.
Talmadge was a senator well known as a staunch segregationist who ordered state schools to be closed rather than desegregated. Eastland was a senator who was an avowed white supremacist known as, quote, the voice of the white South. who came to symbolize white resistance to racial integration during the civil rights era and spoke of black people as, quote, an inferior race. He was also known to refer to black men as, quote, boy. This was pointed out by Senator Cory Booker. Booker says Eastland used those words like that and the racist policies that accompanied them to perpetuate white supremacy and strip black Americans of our very humanity, unquote. And instead of offering a simple apology requested by Booker, because Joe Biden praises and defends his racist BFFs, Joe Biden insisted that Booker himself should be the one to apologize because, quote, he knows better. Mayor Bill de Blasio added that it's past time for Biden's apologies. So I'll note, to this day, Joe Biden has not atoned for his involvement with these horrible racists and pivots by touting his fake involvement with the civil rights movement. In 1988, Joe Biden claimed that he had marched in the civil rights movement, but that has since been debunked by the New York Times. And we can't leave out the 1994 crime bill, which was responsible for incentivizing the building of for-profit prisons and the mass incarceration of black men, also referred to as predators by white liberals. Now here we are in 2020, and one of Joe Biden's primary policy platforms is to place the families of illegal immigrants as a priority over black families. He supports giving free health care to illegals, while you and I will be stuck paying premiums, whether you go see a doctor or not. So the question is why? Why would people like Jim Clyburn and Barack Obama choose Biden? Well, we've gone through the decades and we've only barely touched the surface on why Joe Biden is bad for Black America, but the answer is simple, because it's always the same: power. Barack Obama chose Joe Biden for his perceived foreign policy credentials because he didn't have any credentials of his own. But he must have learned a lot in those 8 years with Joe Biden, because he coaxed him out of his 2016 presidential desires, bypassed his own vice president to lend his support to his Secretary of State instead. Which, if you think about it, I guess Obama ain't black now either. And even in 2020, Barack Obama refused to support Joe Biden, his own vice president, again, until he was the last man standing. Clearly, President Obama knows something perhaps the rest of us don't. And as for Clyburn, we're all too familiar with the devil's bargain on race issues to maintain power. Black liberals back the winning horse to maintain their scraps because you can't win an election or fundraise if problems are actually solved. I mean, how can a Democrat campaign without victims to exploit? And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why Democrats fear President Trump. He is delivering results. He is solving problems and keeping his promises to Black America by lifting up those underserved communities who have been pushed aside by liberal leadership for decades. And the Democrats' base of power has always been relegated to ghettos. So naturally, the demonization, destruction, and character assassination of those who desire to implement positive change for Black and brown communities is simply a business model, a model that has cost Black America greatly. But generational change has finally arrived. They could not defeat Donald J. Trump in 2016. And now Black America has experienced a leader who fights for them and will continue to put their families first and insist that opportunities to pursue the American dream can be achieved for anyone who strives to reach their full potential, be fully reserved for individuals who enter our country legally. We will no longer allow white liberals to mislead the public about who the real racists are.